This is the second population video, and we're looking now at factors affecting population growth. This is a very important video in this whole population section, as this information can apply to a variety of different questions in this area. So it's very important to know these 6 factors which affect whether there will be an increase or decrease in the population growth. So you'd have food supply, improved technology, health, war, education, and the status of women in society, which we'll go through individually. The first 2, food supply and improved technology, tie in slightly together. The idea of food affecting the number of people in a population, just if you think of it first of all from the idea of if there's more food in a region, that means that more children will have that food to eat and therefore will survive into old age. So it will dramatically affect the number of people who are surviving and therefore lead to a growth in the population. So we can see this also in one or two of the examples, but to explain this again also, just moving forward in time here over hundreds of years, if we take maybe we start at say the 1500s or 1600s, it's not really of major importance at the moment, but the idea here of the carrying capacity, that's the amount of food that can be provided by the land. So it's carrying capacity, the ability of the land to provide food for a population. So it can have a carrying capacity for animals also, the number of cattle that can graze in a field. The limit is, say it's 100 cows, will say, that's the carrying capacity for that field. But the carrying capacity is also applies to humans, the maximum amount of food it can supply to us. And with the Industrial Revolution, and increases in food supply, the population growth could occur because more food was available. And this was simply to do with a couple of different things. The idea of crop rotation, for example, began. So you would rotate the crop that is being grown in one particular field year after year. So the fertility of that field is not exhausted. So this increases the output of that one field. So that's going to provide more food. Also, we could introduce fertilizers and pesticides. This could also increase the output per hectare, hectare being 10,000 square meters. And these things which were available in Europe during the Industrial Revolution and very much more recently the Green Revolution, but more so the Industrial Revolution, I suppose, could be spread, these ideas of crop rotation and fertilizers, etc., could be spread across the world through colonization. Into South America, Africa and Asia. More recently, we've had genetically modified crops being planted, and we've seen this quite significantly in India actually. Since 1947, since India got its independence, it has been investing an awful lot of research into the idea of increasing the output of their fields. That's because they've got over 1 billion people living in India, so they really do need to improve the food supply. But if you're looking for one example to where this is affected, the increase in food supply is Brazil. So 1900 the population was 17 million, and then in 2007 it was 192 million people. So massively increased over that 100 years. And it was very much tied in with the improvements in food provision. And the carrying capacity of the land could be increased. It could provide more food for more humans. The second idea then ties in with this. If you look at the left-hand side here, you can see the more traditional methods of farming. So as more improved methods of farming could be introduced through colonization, which you just said, this meant that the carrying capacity of fields could increase. So they could improve, might maybe go from 10 tons, we'll say, of wheat to 20 tons of wheat for that same field. When you introduce fertilizers, combine harvesters, pesticides, irrigation schemes as well. You've got, even looking at the idea of milking parlours, going from the traditional milking of a cow into these huge factories, which milking parlours where cattle are basically tied up with machines and milked. You can massively increase the output. So improved technology has led to increases in food. And that then has increased the population of the world to over 7 billion, which is what it is today. The third factor then, which we looked at the demographic transition model in the first video, was the idea of improving the health of the population. And we could see this in stage 2 and 3 of the demographic transition model, where you've got the early expanding stage, stage 2, where the death rate significantly drops, so more children are surviving. They're not the infant mortality rate. That term, the infant mortality rate, with the number of children dying under the age of 5, that decreases. So things of like the quality of the drinking water improving in a country, the sanitation, whether you're washing your hands, for example, using soap and warm water, childhood vaccinations being introduced to a country, and a good health service with the economy improving. These things really are important for the population to improve, or I suppose grow. And you can see this in rich countries versus poor countries. The idea of Ireland, tuberculosis killed 3,000 people annually until 1948, and then basically eradicated then when a new drug was introduced in 1948. So that's an extra 3,000 people per year that isn't dying. So the death rate is reducing, so the natural increase is improving. Globally, though, when you look at the poor countries, 1.8 billion people. So that's a huge percentage. You know, if you're talking about 7%, 7 billion people in the world, and almost 2 billion are drinking water which is contaminated by feces. That's a serious concern for those areas. Human waste, feces, obviously. Contaminated water itself can transmit a disease like diarrhea, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and polio. And just something as simple as diarrhea, contaminated drinking water is estimated to cause nearly 500,000 diarrheal deaths each year. So basically, they become dehydrated because their diarrhea is so severe. The water that is available to them is what made them sick, so they can't rehydrate or drink water to rehydrate themselves, because that's the situation. That's the third factor affecting population growth. Fourth, there, straightforward enough, I suppose. War. People obviously die from war. During World War II, 60 million people died, which was 3% of the world population at the time. It disrupts farming, health services, water supplies, and sanitation systems. If you think of cities being bombed, we can see the number of people who are dying, for example, in Syria at the moment, and the facilities and services there being severely damaged, hospitals being blown up. So this is going to lead to more deaths, naturally. Civilians as well as soldiers will die in these conflicts, and I suppose, as an aside, war then obviously keeps husbands from their wives, which will reduce the birth rate. So all of those factors there affect population growth, whether it will increase or decrease. On the right hand side then, you've got education. The more educated population is, the smaller the family. So educated mothers practice family planning and are more knowledgeable about their child's health. So you saw this in stage 4, the late expanding stage in the demographic transition model. And we mentioned in stage 5, Germany, families are actually getting smaller. So this idea of the replacement level was mentioned in the previous video 1 for population. So that's the idea. The average number of children per mother is 1.4 in Germany. So in other words, for every 10 mothers, 10 mothers, 14 children are being born. So that's not going to replace the population. As those parents get older and die, there'll be less children left behind them. So the replacement level of 2.1 is not being hit in Germany. So the population is declining there. And that's tied in with a more educated population, and it's seen in the most developed countries in the world. Japan would have an issue with this as well. And that's also why Germany has, we're more than happy, I suppose, to take very large numbers of migrants or refugees coming in during the current refugee crisis in Europe, because they don't have a workforce. Basically, they need a replacement workforce because there's not as many people being born. And then if you compare that then to Chad, where less than 0.25% of women can read and write in that country, and in Chad there are 6.2 children per mother in comparison to 1.4 in Germany. So that's very much a significant identifier whether a country is developed or developing, the level of education and the birth rate. The sixth one here then, and the final one, is the status of women in society. So this ties in with what we've just been talking about there in the education. Women now have a higher status in the Western world and in North America, partly due to the feminist movement, but also higher levels of education. Um, so the feminist movement came about in the 1970s, where they wanted to equalise the status of women with men. And in 1970, the Irish women had an average 4 children, and now they have, 2007, it's 2 children. So as Ireland has developed, the status of women has meant that more women are available for work and working outside of the home. Um, they have more options and they're not confined to the traditional roles in Ireland. And also globally, I suppose they're not that full-time homekeeper anymore, as it were. They've got those more of those options. Whereas in the developing world, women have less opportunities and are more confined to that traditional role. And if you look at the left-hand side here, we can see this, the female literacy rate. So it does tie in with education, but it's the status of women that we're specifically looking at. You can see here that the percentage of females in 1999 here, and Afghanistan, Yemen, Pakistan, Mali. Okay, you can see it's all at around Pakistan. There's not even 20% the number of women who can read and write in Afghanistan. Yemen, you're over 20%, just about. Pakistan and Mali, not much more than 20%. And they're the countries where the population growth is occurring. Okay, and that's quite obvious. Okay, so the lower the status of women in society, the less that they, I suppose, literate that they are, because they're staying at home. The children are staying at home. Girls, they're staying at home to work in the house. They're not becoming educated. They're not getting involved in family planning, and they're having more and more children because of they're maintaining a traditional role in that society. So they're the 6 factors. There's a lot in that information there. I've just put a summary here for you to have a look through, be familiar with. But it's very important, those 6 factors, to be able to memorize the 6 of them and be able to give some details and facts, figures to back up your information, as it applies to a variety of different population questions which can come up. For example, the demographic transition model and why you're moving through those 5 stages.